How prison gangs run the show inside Folsom Prison. The prison that never lost control. For more than a century, this prison has stood as a symbol of California's toughest time. Folsom Prison. It has housed men serving short sentences, and men who will never leave alive. It has survived riots, lockdowns, and generations of reform. But inside these walls, authority has never belonged to just one group. Not entirely to the guards. Not entirely to the administration. And according to court records, correctional investigations, and decades of reporting, much of daily life inside Folsom has been shaped by inmate power structures, organized, racialized, and enforced by prison gangs. This is not a story of rumor. This is not a story of exaggeration. This is how prison gangs, documented, classified, and tracked by the state of California, have influenced control, safety, and survival inside one of America's most infamous prisons. Before we go deeper, if you value factual, deeply researched prison documentaries like this, support the channel by liking this video and subscribing to Beyond the Bars. Your support directly helps us continue telling verified stories from inside the justice system, stories that are often misunderstood, oversimplified, or ignored. Now, back inside Folsom. Why Folsom is different. Folsom State Prison opened in 1880. It is California's second oldest prison still in operation. From the beginning, it was designed for control, not rehabilitation. By the mid-20th century, Folsom housed a concentration of long-term inmates rarely seen elsewhere in the state. According to California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation records, this included violent offenders, repeat offenders, and inmates transferred from other facilities due to disciplinary problems. That concentration mattered. Because prison gangs do not form in a vacuum. They form where protection, identity, and power are scarce, and survival is not guaranteed. The rise of racialized prison gang structures. By the 1950s and 1960s, California prisons, including Folsom, saw the emergence of racially aligned inmate groups. This development is well documented in academic research and court testimony. Unlike street gangs, prison gangs inside California facilities often formed along racial lines as a response to overcrowding, violence, and the absence of personal safety guarantees. At Folsom, these divisions became rigid. Inmates were often expected, implicitly or explicitly, to align with a racial group for protection. Not joining was not always an option. This structure was not created by policy. It emerged organically, and violently. Documented gang presence at Folsom. Over the decades, law enforcement agencies have officially identified multiple prison gangs operating within California's prison system. Some of these gangs, such as the Aryan Brotherhood, the Mexican Mafia, Nuestra Familia, and Black Guerrilla Family, have been repeatedly referenced in indictments, wiretap transcripts, and federal prosecutions. Folsom Prison has appeared in numerous court documents as a location where members of these organizations were housed, monitored, or disciplined. What matters here is not mythology, but documentation. These groups were not informal cliques. They had recognized leadership structures, written or verbal rules, enforcement mechanisms, external communication networks. And according to prosecutors, they often extended influence beyond prison walls. How gang control actually works. Prison gang control does not usually look like constant violence. In fact, most of the time, it looks quiet. According to correctional officers interviewed in state investigations, gang authority is enforced through control over who can move freely in certain areas, rules governing interactions between inmates, approval or denial of basic privileges, such as access to contraband markets, threats that are rarely spoken aloud. Violence is used selectively, because chaos attracts attention. Control depends on predictability. And inside Folsom, predictability has often meant inmates policing other inmates. The role of shot callers. One of the most documented features of California prison gangs is the role of the shot caller. A shot caller is not a rumor. The term appears repeatedly in court documents. These individuals are identified by law enforcement as inmates who issue directives on behalf of a gang. At Folsom, multiple inmates have been classified as shot callers over the decades. Sometimes even while held in administrative segregation. According to prosecutors, orders could be transmitted through other inmates, written messages, indirect communication channels. Isolation did not always mean silence. The balance of power with corrections staff. It would be inaccurate, and irresponsible, to suggest that prison staff lost control of Folsom. The California Department of Corrections has always retained formal authority. But multiple oversight reports acknowledge a more complex reality. In some periods, staff relied on intelligence from inmate sources to prevent violence. In others, lockdowns were imposed specifically to disrupt gang communication. This created a paradox. To maintain order, administrators sometimes had to understand, and monitor, the very structures they were trying to dismantle. Why leaving a gang is rare. Leaving a prison gang is not as simple as opting out. According to sworn testimony from former inmates, departure often requires formal approval, proof of disassociation, long-term protective custody. Even then, the risk does not disappear. For many incarcerated at Folsom, affiliation became permanent, not by desire, but by necessity. Communication, contraband, and power beyond the walls. When the walls couldn't silence them. Communication in a controlled world. Prisons are designed to restrict communication. But history shows that restriction does not equal silence. According to court filings and correctional intelligence reports, prison gangs inside Folsom developed layered communication systems, some legal, some illicit, all closely monitored. Mail, attorney visits, visiting rooms, and inmate intermediaries became channels. None of this is speculative. Federal prosecutors later documented these pathways in detail, often after years of surveillance. Coded language and indirect orders. One of the most documented tools was coded language. Investigators testified that gang communications rarely included explicit instructions. Instead, they relied on phrases understood only by members. A request for paperwork. A reference to business. Mentions of names with no context. On the surface, the letters appeared benign. But in later prosecutions, prosecutors argued these messages carried operational meaning. Sometimes linked to assaults, extortion, or drug distribution. Courts ultimately accepted portions of this evidence, though not every interpretation was undisputed. The role of visiting rooms. Visiting rooms were another focal point. According to correctional policy, all visits at Folsom were monitored, visually and sometimes electronically. Yet investigations found that subtle gestures, seating arrangements, and brief exchanges could transmit information. This did not mean staff were negligent. It meant gangs adapted faster than systems could evolve. Several prosecutions later cited visitor-facilitated communication as one method among many, not the primary one, but a significant one. Contraband, control through scarcity. Contraband is not just about profit. Inside prison, it is about leverage. Correctional reports and criminal cases confirm that prison gangs often controlled access to contraband. Especially drugs, cell phones, and prohibited currency substitutes. At Folsom, contraband seizures increased sharply during certain periods, prompting repeated lockdowns. Investigators concluded that gangs regulated distribution internally, deciding who could buy, who could sell, and who would be punished for unauthorized access. Control created dependency. Dependency created power. Economics of incarceration. Money inside prison does not function like money outside. According to academic studies and correctional testimony, prison economies rely on barter, debts, and informal credit systems. Gangs often enforced those systems. Failure to repay could result in violence, or worse, forced participation in criminal acts. Court records show that some inmates incurred debts they could not escape, binding them to gang service indefinitely. This was not chaos. It was structure. Administrative segregation, containment or command. When prison officials identify a gang leader, the response is often administrative segregation, isolating the individual from the general population. At Folsom, this strategy was used extensively. But prosecutors later argued that isolation did not always eliminate influence. Some shot callers continued to issue directives through intermediaries. Others were replaced quickly. Leadership, investigators concluded, was transferable. The organization mattered more than the individual. The federal government steps in. By the late 20th and early 21st century, federal authorities escalated their response. Racketeering statutes were applied. Conspiracy charges expanded accountability beyond individual acts. Folsom appeared repeatedly in federal cases, not as a failure of state control, but as a node within a broader criminal network. Some prosecutions succeeded. Others faced appeals and evidentiary challenges. But the message was clear. Gang activity inside prison was no longer viewed as contained within prison. Impact on non-affiliated inmates. Perhaps the most overlooked victims were inmates who wanted no involvement at all. Court filings and advocacy reports document that non-affiliated inmates often lived under constant pressure. Neutrality could be interpreted as defiance. Protection frequently meant alignment. This reality shaped daily life at Folsom. Not through open warfare, but through silent rules everyone understood. Official denials and measured admissions. Publicly, corrections officials consistently stated that they maintained control over Folsom. And formally, that statement was accurate. Yet internal reports acknowledged the persistent challenge of organized inmate groups. This was not a contradiction. It was the reality of managing a maximum security population over decades. Control was never absolute. Reforms, resistance, and the limits of control. Can the system ever take it back? A prison under constant review. By the early 2000s, California's prison system was under scrutiny like never before. Overcrowding lawsuits. Federal oversight threats. Mounting evidence that long-term isolation and suppression tactics were producing diminishing returns. Folsom, because of its history and inmate population, became part of that conversation. Not as an outlier, but as a case study. Security Threat Group designation. One of the most significant policy shifts involved the formal classification of prison gangs as security threat groups, or STGs. This designation was not symbolic. It allowed prison officials to track affiliations across institutions, share intelligence statewide, justify housing restrictions and transfers, impose enhanced monitoring. Folsom was one of the prisons where STG protocols were applied extensively. According to CDCR documentation, this helped disrupt some operations, but did not eliminate gang presence. The Step-Down Program. In response to legal challenges and research on long-term solitary confinement, California introduced the Step-Down Program. The idea was gradual reintegration. Gang-affiliated inmates could reduce restrictions by demonstrating disengagement from gang activity. Participation required years, not weeks, of compliance. At Folsom, some inmates entered the program. Others refused. Correctional reports indicate mixed results. Some participants successfully transitioned. Others were removed for violations. The program reduced isolation, but did not dismantle the underlying structures that gangs relied on. Why reforms face limits? Reform efforts collided with a hard reality. Prison gangs are adaptive. They do not require constant communication. They do not rely on a single leader. They survive on shared identity, obligation, and fear. Academic studies caution that reforms addressing conditions do not automatically dismantle organizations. At Folsom, reforms improved some metrics: violence reduction in certain units, fewer long-term lockdowns. But intelligence reports continued to identify gang coordination. The structure endured. Correctional officers caught in the middle. Correctional officers bore the weight of this balance. Interviews conducted for legislative reviews reveal a consistent theme. Officers were expected to enforce strict security, support rehabilitation efforts, gather intelligence, prevent violence. All at once. Many acknowledged that understanding gang dynamics was essential to keeping order. Not to empower gangs, but to anticipate them. This was not surrender. It was risk management. The invisible rulebook still exists. Despite reforms, former inmates interviewed by researchers describe an invisible rulebook that still governed daily life. Where to sit. Who to speak to. Which lines not to cross. These rules were rarely written. Rarely spoken. But they were enforced. And according to verified accounts, Folsom was no exception. Violence, less visible, not gone. Official statistics show fluctuations, not elimination, of violence. Some years saw declines. Others saw sudden spikes. Investigations found that violence became more targeted. Less spontaneous. More deliberate. A sign, analysts say, of organized control rather than chaos. Public perception versus documented reality. Public narratives often frame prisons as either controlled, or lost. The documented reality is more nuanced. At Folsom, the state maintains legal authority. Staff enforce policy. Gangs influence inmate behavior. All at the same time. This coexistence is uncomfortable, but documented. What success actually looks like. Success, according to prison administrators, is not total eradication. It is prevention of mass violence. Containment of influence. Protection of non-affiliated inmates. By that definition, Folsom has seen progress. But progress does not equal resolution. Consequences, communities, and the meaning of control. What the walls cannot hold. The long shadow of incarceration. The influence of prison gangs does not end at the prison gate. Court records, parole reports, and federal investigations show that inmates released from facilities like Folsom State Prison often carry obligations with them. Some are monitored closely. Others attempt full disengagement. A few are documented as resuming criminal activity tied to prison-based organizations. Not all former inmates remain involved. But for those who were deeply embedded, separation is rarely immediate, and sometimes never complete. Families and communities feel the impact. When prison gangs exert influence beyond the walls, communities feel it. Prosecutors have argued, and courts have sometimes agreed, that orders originating inside prisons contributed to crimes committed outside. Families of incarcerated individuals are often caught in between. Visitation pressures. Financial strain. Fear of retaliation, documented in witness statements but rarely discussed publicly. The consequences ripple outward, far beyond the razor wire. Correctional staff, a career under strain. For correctional staff, the cost is cumulative. Oversight reports note elevated stress, burnout, and injury rates among officers working in high-security environments with entrenched gang activity. At Folsom, long-serving staff interviewed in official reviews described a job that required constant vigilance, not just against violence, but manipulation. The work did not end when the shift did. Why total eradication has never happened? One question appears again and again in policy discussions. Why haven't prison gangs been eliminated? The answer, according to decades of research, is structural. Prisons concentrate people with shared risks, identities, and grievances. They limit individual autonomy. They create scarcity. Under those conditions, organizations form. Suppression can fragment them. Reforms can weaken them. But no modern correctional system has demonstrated permanent eradication. That includes Folsom. What control really means? Control, in this context, does not mean total dominance. It means preventing large-scale violence, limiting organized criminal reach, protecting those who want no involvement, managing risk day after day. By those measures, California officials argue that Folsom functions. But function is not the same as resolution. And it never has been. Folsom as a mirror, not an exception. Folsom is often spoken about as a legend. A relic. A warning. A symbol. But in the documented record, it is not unique. It reflects the realities of maximum security incarceration across the United States. The same patterns appear elsewhere. The same challenges persist. Folsom simply shows them clearly, because it has existed long enough for history to leave a paper trail. The final question. After more than 100 years, the question remains unresolved. Can institutions built for punishment also dismantle the power structures that punishment creates? Or will control inside places like Folsom always be shared, uneasily, between the state and the inmates it confines? The documents do not answer that question. They only show us the cost of asking it. Folsom Prison still stands. Its walls are real. Its history is documented. Its challenges are ongoing. And behind every statistic, every policy, and every court case, there are human lives shaped by what happens inside. This has been Beyond the Bars. If you value deeply researched, factual prison documentaries, like this video and subscribe to Beyond the Bars. Your support helps us continue telling the real stories, without exaggeration, without myth, only what the record shows. Thank you for watching.